Faith Has Its Reasons, Integrative Approaches to Defending the Christian Faith by Kenneth D. Boa and Robert M. Bowman, Jr. Overview. The authors provide 5 different apologetic approaches, including a historical outlook for each, as well as the pros and cons of each approach. An impressive undertaking that is a worthwhile tool to learn from. Review. This was the second read-through in 2024 for me, and it was conducted in a book walkthrough on caveofthecross.com, which you can check out all the episodes, which you can check the discussion out that we did on caveofthecross.com. What this book does wonderfully is provides an amazing overview of the history, arguments, and developments of the 4 main views of apologetics: classical, evidentialism, presuppositionalism, and fideism. If you need an overview of these types, this book is the one best resource I've read for that purpose. The authors also do a good job of articulating a fair representation of each view and the explanation power of each. It is not flawless, however. Its critiques of presuppositionalism doesn't seem to be really negative, which is a minor point, since that's a position I favor. The biggest flaw, however, is one of the main reasons for the book. It suggests an inclusive view of each of the 4 views and shows that the use of all of them for particular purposes is the best approach. However, with their approach in mind, they seek out support. However, it appears that an appeal to John Frame's view of a tiered approach, where the presuppositional view is developed first and the other 3 views can be used with intellectual honesty, seems to win out. The authors fail to go back over and think about what critiques folks in the presuppositional camp would make. That being said, I would highly recommend this book as a big overview of the 4 apologetic views. This book and the 5 views from the Counterpoints series would be primary. Final grade, A. Disturber of the Peace by William Manchester. Overview. A biography of American reporter and columnist H.L. Mencken, who was influential in the early part of the 20th century and whose impact is still felt today. Review. I happen to find myself reading H.L. Mencken's writing on the obituary of J. Gresham Machen, no relation, and knew enough about both men that I thought it would be interesting to read biographies of these very opposite and similar men back to back. Since I knew less about H.L. Mencken, I figured I'd start with him. This is a part of what H.L. said about J. Gresham that he did in his eulogy. The Reverend J. Gresham Machen, D.D., who died out in North Dakota on New Year's Day, got, on the whole, a bad press while he lived, and even his obituary did much less than justice to him. To newspaper reporters, as to other antinomians, a combat between Christians over a matter of dogma is essentially a cosmic affair, and in consequence, Dr. Mencken's heroic struggles to save Calvinism in the Republic were usually depicted in ribald or, at all events, in somewhat skeptical terms. The generality of readers, I suppose, gathered thereby the notion that he was simply another fundamentalist on the order of William Jennings Bryan and the Simeon faithful of Appalachia. But he was actually a man of great learning and, what is more, of sharp intelligence. Now, reading his biography of H.L. Mencken, who will now on be referred to as just Mencken, this is odd high praise from someone so against Christianity, but also on point with someone so intelligent, but always bucking the trend of his day. This review is going to be more about the book than the man, but with biographies, the divorce between the two is a bit harder. The style of the biography is probably the quintessential approach of what you want in a biography, but was probably a bit long in the tooth in areas. As Mencken was a pressman, the access to his writings are way more available than someone not so much in the spotlight. The biography does what should be done in the beginnings, in that it starts with a sprint from the family history, moves into a fast jog in the mother and father and upbringing, and slows down to a jaunt through the subject's life while taking a stroll through some of the bigger points in time. The use of linear storytelling with quotes from Mencken's writings or writings about Mencken give you the perfect insight into who Mencken was, both publicly and privately. Although the author doesn't hold back to showing Mencken's faults, both what Mencken would agree about himself and what others, and what having an outside perspective allows ones to see. The biggest negative is this book is the section on the Scopes monkey trial. It's clear Mencken played a key role in it and is known for being a part of it. However, during this section, Mencken almost disappears and becomes more of an eyewitness before leaving the scene for several pages. If you want to know more about the Scopes monkey trial, I guess the author figured the reader would want a lot more detail. But there is so much writing from and about Mencken, there are times when the book tends to slow down. The author does a good job of continuing to reveal certain character traits about Machen throughout his life. There is also enough details to inform you about what certain ideologies, historical events, or ideas that may be not known so well are brought out here. I was really impressed with this book, and I see in Manchen's commentary on J. Gresham Manchen's obituary a good many things of this man who bucked the trend of his day, but whistled a little too often past graveyards when it came to Christianity. He was a rebel for his day, and that was needed, and someone that modern-day authors and commentators would attempt to embody, but that intellectual typification is lost to us in time and with technology. The Hunter S. Thompson before everyone wanted their own Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Here is a very good book about a man worth remembering and worth learning about and worth learning from, both in demeanor and in warning. Final grade, B+. J. Gresham Machen by Ned B. Stonehouse. Overview. A biography on influential American theologian J. Gresham Machen from the early 20th century. Review. I picked up a biography on J. Gresham Machen to read opposite of my one of H.L. Manchen's biography after reading the obituary Machen wrote about J. Gresham Machen. And after he died, and thought the juxtaposition of the two men were similar names in a similar time in a space where they were popular, yet fighting against the societal downfall in their own fields. H.L. against the drab old ways of literature and journalism, a Hunter S. Thompson-esque of his day, and J. Gresham is fighting against the modernist, aka liberal Christianity, of his field. Here's what atheist H.L. had to say about Presbyterian Calvinist J. Gresham, in part. Quote, "It is my belief as a friendly neutral in all such high and ghostly matters that the body of doctrine known as modernism is completely incompatible not only with anything rationally described as Christianity, but also with anything deserving to pass as religion in general. Religion, if it is to retain any genuine significance, can never be reduced to a series of sweet attitudes, possible to anyone to not actually in jail for felony. It is, on the contrary, a corpus of powerful and profound convictions. Dr. Machen tried to impress that obvious fact upon his fellow adherents. He failed, but he was undoubtedly right. Enjoying my learning about H.L. Machen, I was excited to dive into this book. Having some passing knowledge of Machen and his place in church history, I wasn't going in blind and had some high respect of the man. This book, first published in 1954, about 17 years after the death of Machen, by someone who helped start the Westminster Theological Seminary and a respected scholar in his own right, this book was drab and sadly not well done as a biography, nor to really drive home the importance of Machen. Stonehouse puts most of the normal parts of Manchen's life one would expect in a biography, and the amount of time of first-hand sources just from Manchen's letters and his mother's letters are a treasure trove for a biographer. Yet the story of Manchen's life drags and drags. The organization tends to flip back and forth in timeline. There's almost too much focus on the primary documents to account for smaller parts of Manchen's life, but misses out on some of the major parts of his life. For example, about 3/4 into the book, a discussion is made about Manchen's family and personal wealth, something that could have been discussed much earlier and touched on briefly when discussing Manchen's writing career and raising of funds for his seminary. Missing is a discussion on Manchen's very interesting political views, and even testifying before Congress on behalf of opposing a federal Department of Education. We get too much back and forth between his clear love for his mother in notes, and less, albeit some, on the fact that Machen seems to be a sort of atheist, or at least a non-holder of orthodox belief when he's in seminary. The author doesn't make that clear. First-hand accounts and citations abound, but providing a clear picture, especially for one not of the time or of the full understanding of Presbyterianism or even of the modernism versus Orthodox Christianity, has to be sought outside the book. Facts are provided, but storytelling does not happen well. However, through the 3-month slog through this book, I was determined to finish it. I did find a deeper appreciation for Machen and his full life. His time during World War I was interesting, his books, but the author doesn't really go into specifics enough to entice their reading, and his time among other great men of the early 20th century, Princetonian Christians, they were discussed. This was really too bad, as the ability to tell a really interesting story of a really interesting life is clearly there, and some 80 years later, these important fights by similar important men are sadly still being fought, and we need stories from church history to inspire and guide us. Men like those of atheist H.L. Machen could clearly see the need of true belief of the great men like J. Gresham Machen. Final grade, D+. We Shall Fight Them on the Beaches, The Speeches That Inspired History by Jacob F. Fields. Overview. A collection of extracts from the most rousing and inspirational wartime speeches of the last 2,500 years. Cicero to Churchill, Lincoln to Mao, prefaced by brief historical and biographical introductions. Review. This was a pretty good idea for a book that could have devolved into a long-winded background by the editor, or it could have been an easy cut and paste without much thought. Fields chooses from a great array of historical individuals, some well-known and some lesser. He adds a setup opener to each speech that gives the reader some context of what is going on for the speech to take place. What's also nice is that after each speech, Fields gives us what happens as a result of the speech, and some outcomes, like history, don't always wind up well. I decided to add this to our after-dinner reading with the family so we could add some history into our theology and reading them out loud, just as these speeches would have been heard. While our 8- and 6-year-old girls didn't know all the points and people and places and positions for each speech, they've been subjected to enough history from their parents to understand and appreciate them enough. Those in and outs from Fields were just the right size. This could have been a quick read if you're just reading it for leisure, but maybe take the time to read out loud to yourselves to see if you would have been inspired to follow each leader into history to victory or defeat. Final grade, A-. Silence and Starsong Magazine, Spring 2023, Volume 1, Number 1, edited by Joseph Knowles. Overview. An anthology of sci-fi and fantasy short stories that share a common to inspire wonder and awe through stories of high strangeness and other modern fairy tales for grown-ups. Review. For a deeper discussion and review of each of these stories, I had the privilege of discussing them with the Great Katie Room's YouTube channel, Periapsis Press, and so I would point you to those videos as well. Like with all anthologies, there are some that you're going to like and some you're not. What I appreciate about the work here is that the editor, along with the authors, are understanding a world in which the modern wasteland of sci-fi is offering little of value, and the types of stories offered in this anthology series by indie authors are able to give readers heroes to root for, tropes to respect, and a world created that is taken seriously. Without spoiling much or going too far into the details of what each is about, the following are my assessments. A Matter of Honor. A haunted house story during the Middle Ages with men of different religions of the Christian variety from opposing armies must rely on each other to escape. There is some good church history and military history here. Characters are quickly established and done so very, very well. The ideas of honor and glory ring out among the benefits of friendship and brotherhood, a good ending to be had as well. A Wanderer of Ur, a good setting and a character. Really enjoy settings pre-flood or post-flood immediate, as there is a lot you can do there. What's weak here is the story after the setup. It happens too quickly and it ends without enough to make me care. I would like to have seen more here, but there is not enough here for me to demand it to search it out. Archangel. Oh boy, this was the best story out of all of them. The story of demon-indwelt nukes on a Russian submarine where priests are needed to make sure nothing happens as a way to have the biggest threat against the United States is the story. You know what? You have me. You have me by the toes and by the ears or whatever part needs me to listen to the story. It starts off perfectly and draws you in. The amount of build-up and exposition are well done, so well in such a small space of this story. Putting the story into Russian military settings adds a mind picture even more clear of grays and bleak and dread. The madness writing for the characters reminds me of quite a bit of Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. A great ending as well. I don't usually call for short stories to be made into their own things, but if this story came out in a 7-book series, I'm buying the hardcovers on day one. The Two Godly Fishmongers, A Tale of Strange Providences. And this was my second favorite story. It involves a couple of simple characters in the colonial days who find themselves accidentally abducted by an alien. This is a lovely story where the lesson doesn't get lost in the sci-fi and the sci-fi doesn't get lost in the lesson. The ideas of brotherly love, repentance, and the universal nature of God and his providence, even among those among the stars, offer up a great story here. Free lunch. This was a fine and fun. A vacationing family who stumbles upon the house they think they rented, finds a meal set up so they partake, all except skeptical Sally the daughter. The trickster reveals, and the biggest problem I have here is that I need to understand about why or how Sally knows what happens when the reveal is done. That would have put this into a great story in the collection. Have Ye Offered Unto Me, a very rushed story that didn't really explain what was going on with the characters, and if some more details could be added to the demonic aspect of the academia, this could have been a good story with a fun ending. The Gamer, kind of meta-lit RPG-esque that's kind of ho-hum for me, because there's not so much of an establishment of either where we are or what the stakes are or what's happening. It's kind of gets lost. The Secrets of Phelim Drake. Kind of torn on this because the twist at the end was good, but if the story before it happens, it doesn't really make the twist that much of it make sense. The perfect love of a woman's life gone missing, and she's forlorn until he returns and reveals what he was up to. Okay. If a few more of the aspects of the female character would have been inserted, that would have made the twist happen more logically, and I would have really enjoyed this. The Shadow of the Stain. This story about two sisters in witchcraft and revenge just did not leave any impact on me. Hidden Empire. Could you even believe a story about the government being taken over by demons? Yeah, I know, weird. There's a lot to like here in this story. The letter writing style is a bit odd choice rather than just telling the story. After the turning point of the story, it would have been a little nice to reveal a little bit more behind the curtain. However, overall, this was a good story. I really appreciate editor Knowles' note at the end, although it should have been at the beginning, maybe. I will be checking out his other collections in this series and back any others he puts out. Final grade, B+. The Chaplain's War by Brad R. Torgersen. Overview. Harrison Barlows is a chaplain's assistant to a slain chaplain while being a POW on a hostile prison world after being captured by mantis-like aliens who are at war with humanity. But by discussing the nature of religion with one of their scientists, he may have saved humanity from certain destruction if humanity could not screw it up and make it worse. High hopes. Review. I was absolutely taken in by the blurb from this book. An alien invasion stopped by their curiosity about humanity's idea of religion. This pretty much has all the elements you need for me to pick up this book. And yet, sadly, there isn't much in the way of addressing that main story element, and it turns into a standard sci-fi story. The first interactions with the main character, Harrison Barlow, establishes him as a weak character. He's an assistant to the chaplain who died, but has nothing of real value to offer. Even when he's confronted by a curious mantis professor that essentially puts a halt to destroying humanity for the benefit of studying the religious values of humanity, Barlow is feckless and dour. Characterizations of him being a stalwart maintainer of the chapel for anyone of any religion to find some quiet respite, being trapped on a prison colony as a POW is lost in just how much he doesn't offer to be anything. Barlow's backstory of joining the military and coming to the place where we start out story does offer some character building as to why we should care, but it just reveals more of how little he offers and how little religion, any religion, plays a part in the story. The jarring flashbacks isn't earned at first, and it was only the hope that the story would actually fulfill anything promised in the synopsis forced me to continue. The alien professor seems to create an armistice after conducting some minor investigation with Barlow and a few Mormons, but we see nothing at all that would be convincing in this manner. There is no great testing of any real religious value, not even in the general. There is no great or even minor philosophical discussion. Barlow barely understands anything of any religion, and even with the armistice, does nothing to figure out anything. The one area where the alien enemy stops from wiping out all of humanity, and he doesn't even pick up a few pamphlets. The military battles in Sci-Fi are fine, and even the story, if it was just a simple sci-fi story, would have been fine. The meeting of a queen alien and an attempt to survive with the alien professor and another soldier puts Barlow in the middle of the story that could use that time to unpack anything that could eventually lead to peace. What happens? Any motivation to not wipe out humanity happens to the queen just by happenstance. There is nothing here that should convince this alien threat to change or embrace general religious values. There is nothing that Barlow adds or any other character. He falls into success and falls into peace. He doesn't change and he has no character growth. He is the same, I'm just an assistant to the chaplain, that he is at the end of the story that he was at the beginning. It's only when he's able to be pushed by almost literally the entire universe does he think that the thing that saved the human race, and the story doesn't say why, is important? The concept that humanity is different from us mantis aliens offers the same explanation value that is actually seen in the story over anything remotely religious. I can't make this point clear enough. There is nothing that the idea of religion, specific or general, adds to the events of the story. The main character is weak and boring, and while the sci-fi and military aspects are fine, the loss of potential available to such a great concept is almost a bait and switch of the author. If it isn't, then it's an objective failure to provide what was claimed. Such a waste of a good concept. Final grade D. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine. Overview. Meg, her brother Charles Wallace, and new friend Calvin O'Keefe set out on an adventure with 3 mystical visitors to save their father, who is trapped in another dimensional world. Review. This was one of the books that were in a collection of books that made me love reading. This time, there's a 30-ish year difference and a few more thousands of pages in between. With that being said, I understand why I liked the story when I was about 10. The main character, Meg, is that antsy character who is trying to do the right thing, smart, and often fails because she gets in the way of herself. Charles Wallace is the smart kid, but when he's just 6 years old and is practically the leader in human intelligence, it's kind of hard to get behind him. Frank Calvin is a good encourager, but I wish he would have gotten more things to do. The sci-fi elements have a mixture of the never-ending story meets kind of 1984 in space. There is not a lot explained, and Meg voices this and is ignored. I felt for her a lot of this time around in my reading because I too wanted to understand things a bit more. Everything kind of hops from one location to the next without giving really any context. The 3 guiding witches or as angels kind of just assume Meg will do the right action or that Charles Wallace is so smart to do the right thing intellectually. As far as characters, the story develops them quickly at first, but Meg almost becomes too whiny and Charles Wallace too smart and Calvin too brutish. Nothing is really explained, and the message of the power of love is kind of shoehorned in as a result. The story moves too quickly to show why love is what removes control of the communist superbrain, and the fact that I said that a communist superbrain is a bit too boring is a sad thing to even say. There's a lot of issues with pacing and even with theology. I've seen many touts this as a Christian novel or something adjacent, but the author makes it clear that Jesus is just one of the many good figures that typifies the love aspect of conquering the black thing, even if there is a planet that sings like the heavenly choir a hymn for Christ. I believe I first read this in 4th grade, and this is probably where I would recommend it, especially as a gateway into sci-fi. I didn't know until I picked this up that this book was actually, there was 3 other books in the series. I do think I would pick them up to figure out what's more to the story. This isn't a straight out recommended reading for me, but it was influential in my literature upbringing. Final grade B-. The Shape of My Eyes, a memoir of race, faith, and finding myself by Dave Gibbons. Overview. An autobiography of Dave Gibbons where he recounts his complex journey of navigating identity as a mixed-race individual born to a Korean mother and American father, while also grappling with the challenges of growing up in a conservative Christian community, ultimately exploring themes of belonging, faith, and the impact of family secrets on his life and the sense of self. Review. I do not say this as a negative to Mr. Dave Gibbons. He writes well enough, and he told his story in a well laid out way. However, I just did not see anything that made his story one worth telling in book form. I didn't know anything about Gibbons before picking up the book, and halfway through, I was waiting for something that would let me know that this was a book worth reading. Gibbons grew up a son of a vet GI and a Korean mother, and he experiences racism and heartbreak from his family. These are really kind of standard life events and goings through that there isn't much that stands out. Again, Gibbons' life is worthy, and those close to him should know it. Is it worth reading about a half-white, half-Korean person who grows up to be a leader of a diverse church? Meh. The writing is really straightforward. There isn't a lot of prose to punch up life's events or to make one think deeper into life in general. Dave Gibbons has a life worth living, but to me, I don't think it's a life worth reading. Final grade D. Foundational Truths, a Modern Catechism by Israel Wayne. Overview. A question-and-answer doctrinal catechism that is helpful to lead in a family or personal setting. Able to be worked in a 52-week-year devotional, this succinct catechism is useful and well-organized. Review. My philosophy with catechism is that as long as it is biblical and I can know where I stand on each subject to interject where I disagree or add to a topic, the more the merrier. I've done the Westminster Catechism in song and the New City Catechism with my family before, and each has been special. Who doesn't love to ask 6 months later, what is the chief end of man, and hear the response from your kids? Here, Wayne lays out the structure well and allows for a 6-day coverage of 52 topics with each day through the week being a Bible verse. This allows for a discussion on each verse and what it builds into the whole of the main question. Definitions are provided, which is always great to have, and a call to action along with a prayer for the week are nice to have. Each week has a new picture, and the whole book is bright and color-coded without being distracting. A few small quibbles to be had include some definitions of words that seem to be taken so as to broaden the tent of coverage. Definitions for baptism, for example, seem to be taken to not rock the boat as much as it could. The use of the KJV I can see being used so as to include because other versions that may have been desired are subject to copyright restrictions. I won't go on a rant here for that. So if you want something other than KJV, you're going to need to bring your own Bible along. It would have been nice to include action points for each day rather than everything up front for the week, and to include a relevant to the topic hymn just as a reference would have been a chef's kiss. Again, all these are minor issues, and I would recommend this to a new Christian or to a first-generation Christian family looking for a starter catechism, and would happily put this next to New Catechism in recommendation level. Final grade, B. Christ Over Culture, Raising Christian Kids to Stand in Modern World by Andrea Crum. Overview. Discover a powerful guide for Christian parents seeking to equip their children to live out their faith in today's chaotic, self-focused society. Christ Over Culture empowers parents to help their kids discern anti-biblical ideas and ground them in God's truth. Through a blend of theology, worldview analysis, apologetics, and critical thinking skills, Christ Over Culture will equip parents with tangible strategies to run their race, stewarding their children to the glory of God. Review. For most parents who aren't online in the backwaters of the internet and have seen the oncoming tsunami of wokeism and the various other tentacles of it, this book offers a great overview of the issues along with some helpful talking points of discussing with your kids of any age. What I think this book does well is start the conversation Christians need to have about having and developing a holistic Christian worldview, and using several of these important and currently relevant topics as a gateway to do so. This isn't using the jargon of presuppositionalism and philosophical worldview vocab, I know as a nature of my studies, but all signs point to leading one down the correct path of not just responding to these attacks on God's sovereignty, but preparing one's entire family to be ready to give an answer and respond to any competing worldview that comes next. That's what the biggest benefit Crum provides to the Christian reader. She also discusses with welcome frankness the topics of feminism, the rainbow spectrum, transgenderism, and other avenues of those topics. She does so without being hyper-extreme, examples, graphic details, or with any pearl clutching, yet she doesn't mince words with the reality being faced. She balances the need to state the problem and solution within a reasonable scope of the book that will be willingly read by concerned parents looking for advice. So the page count is a benefit here. I would have liked a little more in the way of action points, but the ones presented are specific and biblical. Personally, the need to talk about worldview building is a need, but that might have added a few more chapters, and is understandable why it didn't happen. So no heavy knock against that. Overall, a good primer for parents wondering what the heck is going on and how to respond. Plus, definitions of words, which is always welcomed, and now you, too, can know what a furry is, and I'm not the only one who winces at its cringe. Final grade, B+. Saved, Experiencing the Promise in the Book of Acts by Nancy Guthrie. Overview. Nancy Guthrie presents a theological, rich, and comprehensive guide through the Book of Acts. Review. What Guthrie does here is walk through the Book of Acts and lays out an already historical narrative in another walkthrough fashion. If you're familiar with doing a good Bible study, there isn't going to be anything super hard-hitting, but if you're just getting into Bible study or want to walk with someone through Acts, this is a great little book to do it with. Guthrie pulls references to the Old Testament, either directly referenced or indirectly alluded to, and that's where the biggest strength of the book comes in. Acts is a good starting place for someone getting into Bible study, as it can be read like the Gospels in historical narrative. But we can't forget its place in the whole story of God, and that includes important points of the Old Testament prophecy fulfillment and allusions. There are a few personal stories that I didn't really want more of, and kind of like a receipt where you just want to know the process. But they are not distracting and don't happen too often, mostly at the beginning of chapters. So this could make a good gift for a new Christian or even a family Bible study walkthrough of Acts. Final grade, A. Great Wrath by Terrence Poppa. Overview. The human race is about to be destroyed by the breeder greys and replaced by millions of hybrids they have created. The weapon of choice? An enormous asteroid the aliens have diverted to strike Earth. Only Michael Kendon, a renegade assassin and sole survivor of a crushed resistance movement, can keep it from happening. Review. Another IndiePub here. Being a fan of sci-fi stories that revolve around the mythos of alien greys, government conspiracies, shadowy organizations, and the like, Grey Wrath was right up my alley. Wherein it reminds me a bit of my favorite sci-fi series by Bob Mayer, or Robert Doherty as I know him, the Area 51 series, the story is told in a slightly odd format. The book takes part pretty much in the final third arc of a traditional story. An exposition dump telling you everything you need to know about the aliens, shadow organization, the endgame scenario, and the rebellion by our main character to stop them takes part at the start of the story. Being a fan of the genre, I know the tropes, so I didn't mind it too much. But I do miss the unfolding of seeing how the author would unpack the reveal of everything. The one part where I think it hurts the story is at the conclusion. However, I didn't mind being thrust into almost the end. The story is listed at about 350 pages. That seems like a lot for a story that is on the final part of the beginning. The story moves along quickly, however. Our main character, Kendon, and focusing on three other supporting characters is fine. Again, not getting to travel the entire story with him makes you have to like him right at the start, and since he's rebelling against the shadow government, that kind of helps. Although his initial introduction is a bit iffy, considering his first major decision. I don't know if I've ever really fell in love with a character as a result. However, Kendon does make some good and smart decisions while running from both aliens and government alike. His relationship with secondary character Laura Meller works until romance scene plays out. It's really a decision that doesn't lend support from what's introduced to either character, and in time, the crunch that they're under. The relationship feels more like what characters in the movie Speed have, and call out as being superficial due to being in a high drama situation. The relationship with the last two characters of astronomer Tepler and his teacher friend seem way more cohesive, and I tended to root for Tepler's character a bit more, being the underdog in a number of ways. The story introduces a main evil villain, and yes, there are aliens in the government organization, but this villain doesn't maintain a real presence, and the main threat seems to come from either unmarked helicopters or Men in Black-like agents. Here, the conclusion encounter with the main alien guy is an odd encounter that doesn't hold the impact as a non-entity right until then. The plot points move along well, and switching between Kendon and Tepler adds some good change of pace and exposition options. The missing elements is, surprisingly, lack of aliens or alien hybrids throughout. The shady government agents seemed the biggest threat here, and the sci-fi elements really only happen at the end of the story section. Overall, I liked it. It moves well in pace and information. The characters make logical decisions, even if the bad guys are a little weak in the threat level. Having the third arc of the story being the entirety of the story was a decision I didn't think I would like, but if you're knowledgeable in the tropes of this genre, you'll be all set. Final grade, B-. The Several Liberal Arts, a study in medieval culture by Paul Abelson. Overview. A doctoral study that covers what books were used in the classical education model from the time of the Greeks to the medieval time period. Review. What a fascinating undertaking on the books and materials used of classical education from their starting point to the Middle Ages. Published before the ease of computer database access en masse in 1972, this doctoral dissertation has to be an amazing undertaking in research. To be able to trace the literature of the 7 subjects back from the time of the Greeks through the Romans, through the early church histories, and into the modern Middle Ages, I can't even fathom the poring over sources that had to happen. Taking each of the 7 subjects as their own section, Abelson gives a brief accounting of them and traces them throughout the periods described. Also with an introduction of where the trivium and the quadrivium were kind of first coined in their collective 7. What's interesting is learning just how much the Greeks did for education, and that we would think that the Romans would have kind of added a lot to it. But it seems the Romans tended to be more utilitarian in their gleanings of the Greeks. Christianity taking up the change once paganism decreased, and they happily utilized pagan education under the umbrella of common grace. The longest section is the Latin language section, and it's just how much movement was made later, where a person's lectures would be written down and combined with another book to build the prevailing textbook is interesting. The section on math was also interesting in that it wasn't that scholars hid what was known, it was that so little was known at the time that was passed along, the knowledge was easy and therefore it doesn't stand out in history. The movement of astronomy to be able to calculate Easter was pretty funny. Where math had a desert of resources until the Renaissance period, music was such a universal concept that there was an abundance of resources, although musician wasn't really a thing until the Renaissance as well, but the study of music was drowning in resources. I believe this work could use a great 3rd edition and combining with a resource list to see if one could track down copies of the work discussed would be a noble undertaking. I was quite impressed with how interesting this book was, and one who was interested in classical education and the philosophy behind it would enjoy this work as I did. Final grade, B+. The Door in the Dragon's Throat by Frank Peretti. Overview. When teenagers Jay and Lila Cooper and their archaeologist father travel to Nippur, an uninviting land of deserts and danger, they must search to uncover the truth behind the ancient legend. Locals claim that inside a dark cavern called the Dragon's Throat is a forbidden door that brings certain death to anyone who tries to open it. Armed with the knowledge that God is more powerful than any legend or curse, Jay and Lila plunge down into the Dragon's Throat, determined to find out what awaits them on the other side of the door. This daring tale will have you on the edge of your seat. Review. A friend of mine describes this book as, what if Indiana Jones had kids? Sold. This is Peretti in writing, tone, and subject matter through and through. There's a good story here, although the conversations are a little stilted in the Christianese way, but boy, does this book move quick. There's almost no time wasted in atmosphere building or any kind of fat. You get an exposition dump right at the beginning in both plot and characters, and you're off and running, almost literally. The best part of the story is the character's focus. What's interesting is that the modern story, the kids would be kind of the central character, and the parent would be off somewhere or knocked out or need rescuing. What's good about this is that you have the father as almost the main character, and he introduces us to his 2 children, who we do get to follow. The children aren't annoying or bickering characters, nor are they naive shelter kids who always do the right thing and covered in so much sugar that it's gross. They take part in the action and problem solving to a high degree of competence alongside their father. With the fast-moving plot comes some hiccups in getting across what's fully happening or missing out in explanations. Where the team is in the main of the story is a spot where no one has ever returned. We don't really know specifics of what happened since no one has breached the door. Nor did I have a full understanding of the shaking ground or what mind's eye of the space looked like. For an 80s young adult book, maybe this was to be expected, but it could have utilized about a half dozen pages in helping to convey those things. Peretti hasn't always been the best at realistic dialogue, and some of that is here. However, it isn't so cheesy that it takes you out of the story or makes you roll your eyes at the characters. The ending is great, and in Peretti's wheelhouse of course that's what it is, style. And that was really fun to read again from him. Overall, a fun little YA novel that I'll check out the next in the series. Final grade, B. The Autobiography of Ben Franklin by Ben Franklin. Overview. An autobiography of founding father and American Ben Franklin. This is also the first book in the Harvard Classic series. Review. This is a different kind of autobiography that I've read before. Starting out with your normal starting point of birth and early childhood, Franklin is clearly remembering a lot of important aspects of his life that were formational to his life. However, there's too much detail on low key points and almost nothing on what you'd want to hear from Franklin about. Things like the Revolution or his time after as ambassador are absent. He has a few tales of his inventions and startups that are great, but it's almost an afterthought to the points he's making. In fact, there are parts where the publisher or Franklin talk about the section just ending or Franklin's family encouraging him to write more. It's a bit bizarre. A good majority of the book covers Franklin's coming up with and starting his own printing business. Either the man took scrupulous notes or has a mind for the details, but it's almost impossible for someone to have had that minutia of recall for jobs he took when he was a teenager. There are some great moments in there, like him starting a fire department, how he got stinking rich off his Poor Richard's Almanac, and a brief mention of his kite and electricity experiment. He talks about him being a deist, but falling in love with George Whitefield for his rhetoric and his preaching. You also get some honest elements of Franklin being a bit of a sleaze that he mentions just as a matter of fact, like failing to marry a woman and keeping her waiting or pursuing another woman that is someone else's. He devotes a little time to talking about his wife, children, family, after leaving them for his own business adventures when he was young. There are a lot of little interesting life lessons and tidbits from here, but this isn't really going to be the place you want to go to read about the full aspect of the man. You'll want to find someone who is a good author who will use this book in conjunction with others. An okay book, as long as you know what to expect when going into it. Final grade, D+. The Journey of Five by Jenny Phillips. Overview. When the river suddenly dries up without explanation and strange soldiers demand gold to make it flow again, the village council chooses a group of 5 special people to discover who these soldiers are and how they are controlling the flow of water. Review. What starts out as an interesting plot with a mystery of a river shutting off and an army extorting villagers to turn the river water back on for a time really gets slogged down and loses the plot. Each of the group has their own special ability, even the dog with the main character. Finn, the main character, having his special ability revealed later in the book. While this is a good plot point and a character reveal, the book fails to build up Finn at the beginning of the book to make it known that the leaders who chose him knew about this trait. The story moves along well at first, but when it dips into realistic territory of finding food and shelter, it really slows to a crawl to become almost a chore to continue. The sidetracks of the 5 where they help every person on the way adds to the overall plot. However, in the context of the motivation of the characters, these actions would be dooming their villagers they're supposed to be helping. The story picks back up towards the end with some good reveals and an excellent lesson on the Christian message of standing in the place of guilty people. However, the plot doesn't do enough to earn that lesson other than the character just wants to help the clear guilty and bad guys. Overall, the beginning and end are well written and makes you care about each of the characters. The ending sums up everything nicely, although a bit too simplistic to reach a happily ever after end. But that middle part of the book was a journey in and of itself. Final grade, C. Little Amish Schoolhouse by Ella May Seyfarth. Overview. The story follows a group of Amish children as they attend school in a small one-room schoolhouse. The children learn important lessons about life, love, and faith as they study together and grow as individuals. Review. Slow and plodding, very long chapters with nothing learned or happening. Even when a plane crashes in the front yard, it doesn't raise an interest in the characters and story. My 8-year-old and I were bored out of our minds with this. Amish fiction should not be embraced. Final grade, F. The Record of the Paladins, Book of Oliver by B.P. Coppin. Overview. Oliver has special powers and he's been trained all his life to be ready to fight the demons that walk among us. He meets a woman who introduces him to the order he was raised to join to fight the ultimate evil. Review. Another indie win here. I've always enjoyed the kind of books where the hidden world is revealed to a few and they fight against the things that go bump in the night. Mix in some gunplay with Christianity, I'm pretty much right at home. What McCoppin does here is present characters within the trope who are actually likable and not ones to cause you wonder why anyone would follow in the footsteps of the order or not wind up needing some serious psychiatric counseling. The main character, Oliver, being plucked out of the dreary orphanages by his mentor and new father, Garen, immediately gets the story rolling along with having probably one of the most heartful and amazing scenes in an early part of a book I've read in a while. The scene in the diner is one that told me that I was in the right book. The unraveling of the story as we proceed in real time, mixed in with flashbacks to Oliver's upbringing, doesn't slow down either story, and both interjections help break up the pacing without failing to resolve with an overused cliffhanger. The main current story packs a lot of action, and it shows that demons are, well, actually demons, and therefore the bad guys. The story takes a Catholic flair, which goes to the adage of, if you need rituals at an exorcism, it needs to be Roman Catholic based. The characters are generic Christian enough not to ruffle too many feathers, except those whom wish feathers to be ruffled. The editing and the pacing flow the story well, and the cyclical nature of the story adds a note of completion that many stories with a flashback doesn't take advantage of enough. A few notes of quibble is that once the reveal of the Paladin occurs, there's kind of no big overarching story or end goal presented, and it seems to be a presentation of 3 missions that build up to the last third one. I don't think there was enough storytelling that really focused on the depth and consequences of the current events. A lot of the why questions are left unasked or unanswered that pertain to the Paladin storyline, but there is a perfect amount of time given to Oliver's backstory, even if the final portion is a bit too on the nose of High Plains Drifter with an actual good guy. Finally, the tank character of Roland, talking only in Bible verses, is a choice, but not one really given a reason other than, oh, you really do that, huh? Yet, when conversing with a Russian woman in Russian, that may or may not have happened, and it doesn't add much depth to the character, other than treating him almost like a literal tank character. All that to say, I really enjoyed this book, and enjoyed the mentor-mentee as it presents an amazing father-son relationship using adoption of both physical means and spiritual means to weave through the story. The action is pretty intense and adult, with weighted reality of you might not be able to save everyone when going up against the demonic world. I would definitely check out more from the series and more from the author. But seriously, that diner scene was perfect. Final grade, B+. How to Read a Book. Advice for Christian Readers by Andrew David Nassali. Overview. The ins and outs of how and why and when a Christian should read different types of books in different ways. Review. A good book that knows its audience. Experienced Christian readers won't find too many tips to pick up here, but maybe to put the ideas in place never contemplated. I would find this book especially helpful for maybe a teen reader or a parent teaching their children the value of reading with a Christian worldview and how to think about books under that worldview. I would file this under the Redeeming X category of Christian books that have really come to the forefront with the increase of popularity of presuppositionalism, especially in the Reformed sphere. Nassali is a perfect author to tackle this subject, the perfect level of nerd and scholar, lovingly said. He's a researcher who enjoys reading fiction, so he runs the gamut of how to take seriously reading in many different forms, from the gloss of the in-depth rigor to the fiction setting. Setting the Bible as the primary reader or the Christian reader, Nassali launches from there, but always with some touch point back to Scripture. At times, this almost gets in the way of him making his other points, if at all possible. While this isn't trying to be the Christian Mortimer Adler in-depth or in length, it would have been nice to have some more in-depthness in certain areas or literature styles. Nassali uses some familiar authors in his world, but for those not in his sphere of people who might not know who he's talking about, this might be a further hindrance. Yet, this is a very valuable book from the Christian who is the experienced reader to the Christian who knows that the one book did so much to change his or her own world, so maybe there are a few more out there that can help the journey further. Final grade, A-. Everyday Gospel Christmas Devotional by Paul David Tripp. Overview. 25-day December devotional leading up to Christmas. Review. First of all, there is nothing bad or heretical here. Tripp knows the scripture truth, and the devotional verses go along with the short teaching from it. However, this feels more like a cutout of some stories that kind of tie into scripture verses enough to sell a book. There's a focus on Christ throughout scripture, but there's nothing very Christmas-y about it. The stories involved in the exposition are nothing much more than some personal anecdotes. Again, nothing wrong here, but nothing to really come together as a family and talk about aspects of Christmas or Advent. We'll finish it, but begrudgingly. Final grade, D+. The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Overview. One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness, find them. Young Frodo Baggins finds himself faced with an immense task as his cousin Bilbo entrusts the Ring of Power to his care. Frodo must leave his home and make a perilous journey across Middle-earth to defeat Sauron, but he doesn't take the journey alone. Review. Like The Hobbit, there's not much I could write here that would be of great value that probably the millions of other readers have said and discussed. However, the story through the mind of a child might offer some insights that would be of value. For 2024, I read the story to my 8-year-old, going about half a chapter at a time. As the reader, Fellowship offered many slow spots that made it, at times, difficult to encourage a sit-down and read time. The Hobbit had been undertaken previously as a backdrop, and the only movie watched so far is the Rankin Bass The Hobbit version after reading the book. The following is a review by the 8-year-old with only questions prompted by the father. The listener enjoyed the plot as a whole. The story follows the slower passage of time without being too long in between plot points. The details used laid out the world, and the length of the description helps add to the sense of time and passage for just the right amount of time. The listener liked how the journey wasn't smooth, and it offered a lot of exciting moments between the travel sections. Overall, she found the pacing was done well and enjoyed the world building a lot. A little bit too slow and too detailed in the world building for the reading dad. But I digress. The characters were a big hit, with listeners' favorite Gandalf returning as the mysterious but kind wizard. Sam was also a new favorite, as he exhibited a mixture of seriousness and silliness. Frodo was a fine character, and some of the parallels were seen between him and Bilbo, but also being his own character worth following. The listener liked how many fewer characters there were than in The Hobbit, as she wasn't able to remember or imagine all the dwarves in The Hobbit, but all the distinct characters here. The interactions between the characters were interesting, and the connections between characters in different parts of the story made for a more interesting and well-rounded story. Also, the unrealized backstories yet to be uncovered or fulfilled are exciting to think about what may be coming up. The best scene for the listener was the Khazad-dûm and the battle with the Balrog. Somewhat added to the enjoyment was the reader really getting into the voices and rising action. Yes, fun stuff. Although the final outcome of that plot section was not enjoyed, and the loss was felt in the story, and it was felt by the listener. Another favorite scene was Galadriel's mirror scene, again added by a passionate reading, but on the opposite end, she didn't enjoy Boromir's turn towards the end of the book. In comparison to The Hobbit, she enjoyed it more than Fellowship, as it was self-contained, and there was no cliffhanger ending. However, she is looking forward to the next book. The listener gave the score a final grade A-. And thank you so much for listening and choosing the little parts. Of course, you can always check out the reviews in written form, cavesacross.com, and on the various platforms I mentioned at the beginning. I hope you enjoy your reading for 2025 and come back next time for our conclusion of our book and anything else that we might read for the next year, for God's glory. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.